Whenever they meet up on a bridge, they're going to kind of chuck each other off. That probably happened anyway, but not as part of this kind of codified violence. Okay, we're back in Venezia today, and well, for another history kind of insight. So today we're going to talk about something really interesting, I think, and it's right there. It's that, well, the cause of our conversation, let's say the main topic is going to be that bridge you see just over to my left. But the topic will move into, into more broad conversation about violence in the Middle Ages, like societal violence in a sense, like organized violence, how this was codified and organized and in a way funneled into useful uses, let's say. But we'll start from this bridge. So this is what is called the Ponte dei Pugni, which is essentially the fists bridge or the punches bridge. Pugno can mean both the actual fist, but also the act of punching. And well, we'll stop here so you get to see it a little. But in the Middle Ages, and well, let's say from the 14th century down to the beginning of the 18th century, this was the center, one of the centers, because there were a couple actually, of a big kind of organized brawl between two factions in the city of Venezia. So the Nicolotti and the Castellani, I think. So anyway, there are two names of, two groups of people, let's say. We'll talk about the kind of origins in just a moment. But would occasionally meet between September and Christmas. That was kind of the window they had to meet up on this bridge and engage in a fist fight, essentially, trying to throw as many of the opposing people off the bridge and into the canal. This, as you can imagine, often devolved into a full-on brawl. And there are some images of the, well, not of the time, but let's say kind of the time, that depict these brawls, and they're massive. You have boats all over the canal, people fighting, people falling into the water. Everyone is looking out from the windows and everything. And these went on until 1705, year in which there was violence escalated to the point that people started using knives or daggers, I would imagine. And essentially at that point, the Doge said, no more. And that tradition that was violent turned into more of a carnival parade in a sense. It's still a competition between different areas of the city, but of course with less bloodshed. Okay, we'll wait for the bridge to be a little free quickly because we want to check it out from the top. But suffice it to say that at the time you wouldn't have had these parapets. So most of the bridges in the city would have been flat. So the whole point of throwing people off the bridge would have been way easier. Just a quick push would have thrown someone in the canal. These bridges now date to, I think, the 19th century, or they've been, fixed up and redone at some point in the 18th or 19th century, if I'm not mistaken. But what we're going to see here is a trace of the original medieval structure of the bridge, but also of the event itself. So if we look here, you'll see we have 4 footmarks, essentially. And as far as I understand, these are the original ones. I think they've been recovered and reused. But these footmarks are where the champions would have placed their foot to start the competition. So they would have been on opposing sides of the bridge, and as far as I understood, the other 2 would have been for the judges. So you would have had 4 people here. That's because the event would have kicked off as a duel between champions. So I suppose the Nicolotti and the Castellani would have selected their strongest champion. And these guys would have started off the event by placing 1 foot each on opposing sides. You would have had 2 judges. There to make sure everything was following the correct process, and then they would have started trying to push each other into this water. And then after that, you would have had essentially the brawl escalating between factions, and then escalating to, the whole neighborhood, essentially. So, as I was mentioning, the rivalry between the Nicolotti and Castellani is quite old. So it's said that it goes to times even pre-Venice, in a sense, when inhabitants of nearby towns of Jesolo and Heraclea, well, got into a bit of a argument, and that hatred persisted even when people from these towns eventually kind of settled in Venice and settled in different neighborhoods mostly. And, well, basically they kept hating each other to the point that they had their own colors, they had, their own parish churches that, in fact, their names, Castellani and Nicolotti, refer to, I don't remember the exact name of the churches, but each of these groups had their own church as a reference point, let's say. Anyway, I think the Castellani were dressed in black, so they had like black sashes, or hats, and the Nicolotti in red, but I may be mistaken. So why is this interesting for someone who perhaps is interested in swords or medieval history or history of violence in a sense? I think it's really interesting because what we see here in the very unique framing of Venice is something that we see repeated in a lot of different cities. So if you're familiar with the Palio di Siena, if you're familiar with the Calcio Storico Fiorentino, for example, just to speak of Italian traditions, but I suppose this would even be true for kind of traditions you see in England, where you have, I'm sure there's, I don't remember now, but there's a small town or city where like the population gets into a giant fight for a ball, and it's like a full-on brawl on the streets, with people just beating each other up for, to win the ball. And you see a lot of these overall in a lot of medieval cities. And this is interesting because in one sense it's often an outbreak of factional violence. So these are oftentimes groups that are affiliated to like political parties or groups in a sense. Maybe local neighborhood kind of affiliation, this kind of stuff. So it's kind of a grassroots violence in a sense. But then this gets taken or controlled by the authorities of the time, and usually in this case we're talking often about communal authorities. So these are like the Italian comuni, more than I would say like the lord of a castle or something like that. And these explosions of grassroots violence essentially get twisted into something that is barely controlled. And what we then see is that these controlled moments of violence essentially slowly morph into traditions, and as violence becomes less and less acceptable, or as things escalate, or as times change essentially, they also change, and violence is kind of replaced by kind of a sublimated form of it. So it becomes a competition that's a little less violent. It becomes a competition of floats or of creative or of, athletic endeavor rather than violence. So, for example, the Guerra dei Pugni, so the war of the fist fight war, essentially, that we're talking about now, is originates, I think, around the 14th century. Together with quite a lot of these traditions, some may be older as well, but let's say a lot of them find their roots in this kind of, in the medieval comuni, I think, at least for Italy. And then they kind of die off, in this case in 1705, as I mentioned, with a massive brawl. And I think this is interesting because it tells us a few things about life in medieval cities, but it also tells us something about violence. And the reason why I think this bridge we just saw, but beyond the bridge itself, the kind of violence it symbolizes and the way this was funneled into a controlled format, I think is really interesting because it tells a lot about medieval society and how people lived violence in their everyday life and how it was perhaps leveraged to turn it from something potentially destabilizing into sometimes an asset. So as I mentioned, you'll see this in a lot of cities, similar forms of violence turned institutional in a sense, but there are considerable differences. So if you look, for example, at what you see in the Palio di Siena, for example, or what you see in the Calcio Storico Fiorentino maybe, you're looking more at pretty well codified events where there are sets of rules, and for instance, already the fact of using horses in the Palio di Siena may point towards this being higher violence that kind of becomes tradition. So of course, who would have been practicing on horses, who would have been showing off their skills in horse riding wouldn't have been, you know, the peasants of the city or the militia. It would have been the knights or the people with the means to be able to spend time training and owning horses and armor. So it almost points to a more military tradition that then slowly loses its kind of violent and martial meaning to become a tradition. But what you see instead in the Guerra dei Pugni here in Venice, which unfortunately, well, I don't know if unfortunately, but it doesn't happen anymore. But it still happens today in the Gioco del Ponte in Pisa, for example. What you see here is more instead bottom-up kind of violence, as I was mentioning, a grassroots violence. And this was, of course, dangerous on the one hand, but it was also crucial for the political administration of Italian comuni at the time. And this is because you often did not have trained soldiers. So you couldn't rely on a kind of fixed number of highly skilled fighters that would be able to, you know, protect your city if needed, or take over other places if needed as well. You had essentially city militias. And these city militias didn't really have time to be, you know, training full-time or in a professional manner. So they would rely often on these kinds of, I don't know how to express them, maybe they're events turned, you know, violent, controlled violence, merged with celebration and parties and tradition as ways to ensure that people were kind of equipped and ready for when the time came. By the way, I'll let you enjoy a second this beautiful view of misty Venezia. Last time we were here, it was really sunny and hot. I'm still sweating because my temperature regulation is just bad, but it's a very nice temperature. Anyway, so what we see here is almost two opposite directions for violence, and how this violence then gets turned into an asset by, or controlled in a sense by the institutions. To the point that if we look at, for example, representations of these brawls or fights, they look like, you know, some anarchy in the city or something like that. And oftentimes it devolved into that for sure. But it was regulated. So for example, there were regulations around what could be used and what could not be used. There was, as I mentioned before, a window in time during which these events could happen. It wasn't just okay, the Nicolotti hate the Castellani, so whenever they meet up on a bridge, they're going to kind of chuck each other off. That probably happened anyway, but not as part of this kind of codified violence. So we have a time frame that's, as I mentioned, September to Christmas. We have rules in terms of how the event would happen. So as I mentioned again, we had in the initial duel with judges and champions, and then kind of things devolved a little. And we also know what kind of equipment was permitted in these kinds of clashes. So we know, for example, that helmets were okay, as were shields, as were breastplates. Weapons were not, apart from like sticks or reeds, or, you know, something that wouldn't cause permanent, well, I mean, a stick can cause permanent damage, but you know what I mean. And we also see that as soon as knives popped out, or at least popped out as a serious problem, the whole thing was cut down immediately. So, by the way, the fact of helmets is really interesting, because if you're familiar with the Gioco del Ponte, there are still a lot of helmets from the Gioco del Ponte which you find around museums, but also in private collections. And usually these are modified 15th century or 16th century helmets. So quite antique, quite important, but as these became obsolete in the armories of the actual city and didn't have a function anymore in terms of military equipment, they were kind of cannibalized by the teams of the Gioco del Ponte, and they'd usually apply kind of a wider visor. So they'd replace the visor and put a bunch of bars in front of it so it was easier to breathe, of course, and see, which is really interesting because you see that nothing changes in the world in a sense. And today we have like I think it's called the wolf thing visor on Buhurt masks, helmets for instance, and they're essentially exact reproduction in a sense, not necessarily in the way they look, but you see how different needs, so safer clashes mean that you can afford to have more visibility, more breathability, and that changes the way the helmet looks. Anyway, this is a different topic for a different conversation, but if you like it, go check out the helmets of the Gioco del Ponte, they're really cool. So what does this tell us perhaps about violence in medieval societies? Because when you think of this as something that doesn't happen in today's world, you can easily think, oh yeah, this is a confirmation of the fact that times were really violent and, you know, people just beat each other up and killed each other for fun, as a party in a sense. But that is not really the case. Now, that's not to downplay the fact that violence was endemic in society for most of history, by the way. It's not an exclusive prerogative of the Middle Ages. But it's to say that you have to view things through a lens of the time, in a sense. So yes, in every society there are pushes. Let's see if this alley is open. Oh yeah, let's go check it out. So this is a really narrow one. So in every society you have these pushes for violence, for factional violence. And what I think these events tell us about Italian medieval cities, at least, is that there was an interest on the part of the administration of these cities, or if not an interest, an obligation in a sense, because if you can't completely vanquish that violence, that factional violence, it's probably in your interest to harness it. Moreover, there's the fact that you need people to be trained to violence, because one thing is brawls in the street, but when you get attacked by, you know, someone else, when Milan comes knocking at your doors for, I think this is a dead end, but when, yeah, the Milanese troops are coming, in the case of Venice, for instance, you kind of need your citizens to be ready, prepared, and equipped, not only in terms of physical training, but in terms of not fearing the clash, in a sense. And of course, we shouldn't dismiss the function of this violence even as a exhaust valve, in a sense, as a pressure valve. So yes, there's kind of thinking around it, there's a will to harness it and control it and turn it into something like into training for militias and turn it into tradition and whatever you want. But of course, this, in those days as today, some form of this kind of violence is a kind of pressure valve for a lot of social bubblings and upturnings. So we see that in sports, for example, a lot. So in reality, nothing seems to have ever changed. We still today have the same urges and pushes towards behaviors that don't conform very well with a society, with living in a society. I think what has changed, though, is the way in which today we don't need that violence to be harnessed in any way. We can afford, to a certain extent, and that's probably quite debatable, to simply say there's no place for that violence. And violence is a prerogative of, I don't know, law enforcement or the army or this, or whatever other institution is afforded that privilege. What we see is that in the past that was not the case, and violence was a little bit of an everyday event. So maybe let's focus a little on the view before we keep talking about violence in Middle-Age Venice. But here you go. Oh, sorry.
Sì, è un ambiente un po' strano.
Not bad. Yeah. Gives me some time to recover my breath as well before I keep talking. But sorry. But essentially, as we've seen, we have violence that gets harnessed by power into something that they can, at least for a time, control. But I think there are a few more considerations that we can make on this phenomenon, and because they're really interesting, I think, and again, they tell us a lot about medieval society, and they help us maybe see it with different eyes. One is that, and keep in mind this is speculation on my side, like I don't have the documents, especially not here with me, I'm just walking on the streets, but by looking at regulations and at what the requirements and what the rules were around these controlled forms of violence, we can perhaps speculate or understand a little better what the needs were of different cities, of different groups in different times. For example, what we see with Pisa and what we see with Venice is that there's a strong focus on the kind of bottom-up violence, so something that's of the people. It connects a lot, I think, with city militias, and it's very infantry-led in a sense. The whole training and the whole purpose of this controlled violence is the direct clash of people. But if we look at the Palio di Siena, if we look at the other horse kind of cavalry-led forms of martial display, we see something a little different. So this can inform our understanding of what needs pushed that certain city in that time to decide to preserve or control a certain form of violence. Another thing is in the kinds of weapons and gear that was used or accepted. So for example, here again in Venice and in Pisa, we see helmets, we see cuirasses, we see shields. There's basically a mimicry of infantry clash again. What we see in other cities, for example Trieste, where I'm from, you see that in the statutes there's a big push for crossbows instead. So the city militia, the citizen, was expected to be a good crossbowman. And not only that, he was expected to have a crossbow, and the prizes for winning the events in which people would challenge each other in crossbow prowess were a crossbow. So it was very geared towards instead more something of a wall defense, more a true city militia in a sense. So people needed to be ready to be able to run onto the walls and shoot at an attacker when needed. Whereas what we see for Venice and Pisa in a sense is different, and what we see for Siena and maybe Firenze is again different as well. So I don't have the explanation for all of these phenomena. Like I can give a reason why I think certain things happened the way they did, but I think this is a really interesting thing to investigate if this is a kind of the topic you're interested in. So anyway, just to quickly recap, because I realize that with a lot of interrupting while filming, sometimes I may lose my train of thought. I think what I want to suggest to you as something to think about and to research yourselves if you want is how, especially in the example we have for Italian comuni, Venice for example, and other cities in Italy in the Middle Ages, we have a phenomenon of violence being harnessed into something useful for the power, for the institutions. This violence takes two directions, let's say. So it goes from the bottom up in a grassroots shape, from the people's violence, which is often the manifestation of factional violence, of the kind of the mud and trenches of medieval politics of the time, of city politics, and it gets harnessed into training forms for city militias, but also into traditions and into a sort of proto-sport in a sense. And on the other hand, we have the knightly traditions of cavalry and of trained military troops that get be, well, they get perhaps unsharpened or blunted and turn into a palio or into a form of sport or into a form of competition, while maintaining elements like horses and these forms of medieval violence are very important, or can be very important, in telling us how cities of the time functioned, what their priorities were, and how people of the time lived. Instincts and trends and pushes, social pushes that we still feel today, but deal with in different ways. And we're unfortunately moving here in the belly of the beast a little. This is, we're getting in the really fancy area, so you'll see a lot of people, and I hope my voice comes through. But just one last invitation I have for you guys. If you're in Italy, or whether you're in any European city that has these kinds of traditions that still go on and happen, make sure to go see them, because what may seem from the outside almost like a Ren fair kind of thing, or just a reenactment, is lots of times a straight continuation of traditions that go back to the Middle Ages. And when you see the horses racing in Piazza del Campo in Siena, or when you see a smaller version of a crossbow competition or something, that may be, there may be a straight line almost connecting you there viewing this moment to people in the Middle Ages viewing this moment, but with a different mindset and for different reasons. Anyway, we're here in Piazza San Marco now. It's getting dark, so I'm not sure how that translates to the camera, to the video, but I'll just quickly let you enjoy the views here, because I think it's quite worth it. One last consideration, before I go, is that when we talk about, I think should make an effort to ensure that we don't look at societies of the past as completely different from ours. So when we talk about their violence, yes, they were violent societies, but the people weren't different from what we are in a sense. And so it does nobody favors to look at these societies in a way exaggerated form and think that, every year when there was this Guerra dei Pugni, there was some kind of massive brawl with people dying all over the place. If we look at the dates, we know that it started in the 14th century and ended in 1705. That means that, being generous and placing the start right at the end of the 14th century, it's 300 years of tradition of people beating each other up on a bridge. And for 300 years, that tradition was viewed as acceptable. And we know how societies of the time viewed murder and violence, so we know they weren't lenient on these things. So that says something. It says that they were able to harness that violence effectively, at least for what were their capacities and their, priorities of the time. And when the time came to kind of end that, they were able to do it in a snap. So just keep that in mind. I think that's always useful when looking at societies of the past. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I really enjoy making these outdoor kind of walk around videos. So if you like seeing them, please like and subscribe and comment. Do whatever you can to engage, because that really helps. And if you want, support me on Patreon too. That would be really useful. Whatever you do, I'll see you in the next video. Bye. Also guys, if you look up there, this place is called Campo della Guerra. Now it may be a little bit dark, unfortunately, but it means Campo is like the square of the war. And if you see that bridge we're reaching now, it's a little dark, so I apologize if, but this wasn't a planned part of the video. I didn't think I would get to here today. But this is Il Ponte della Guerra, so bridge of war, but it's not referring to, some war with the Ottoman Empire or against Milan or something. This is another one of those bridges that was used during these civilian wars, during these citizen wars. So again, it wouldn't have had these parapets, and it would have been another place where people chucked each other into the canals. And one last note, speaking of how the institutions supported or absorbed this form of violence, there are documents We know that the canals were dredged or cleaned before the events to avoid harm to anyone who fell into them. Now, I don't know whether this means harm in the sense of dying from disease from the dirt, or it was more like removing debris or stuff like that. But also the bridges themselves were reinforced because they expected, obviously, a certain amount of people to be on them at the same time, and so they had to be reinforced. So this kind of goes to confirm how this wasn't just a spontaneous outburst of people becoming violent and the state tolerating it, but it was an effective state-sanctioned kind of violence. So again, there we have Calle al Ponte della Guerra. So the Calle is the street towards the bridge of the Guerra. So anyway, I just wanted to show you this even if it's a little too dark.